We will discuss the topic of what the Vedas are, why they need to be studied, and what types of Vedas exist. If we look at the structure of Vedic works, we will see that this structure has a very complex scientific foundation. In essence, the Vedas of Vedic literature are not just the well-known four Vedas, Rig, Veda, Sama, Yajur, and so on, but rather encompass over 2.5 million texts and books, of which only about 3 to 5% are known in the modern world. That is, we know that 18 Puranas, Ishikas, Upanishads, Aranyakas, Sutras, and so on have been preserved. But even the insignificant amount of Vedic literature that has survived to this day holds undeniable value. What was written in these 2.5 million books? Well, essentially all systems of knowledge, starting from spiritual knowledge and gradually revealing how this spiritual knowledge influences our world, physics, chemistry, medicine, and literature, up to sciences such as botany and the art of building flying machines, electricity, and other related fields, various other sources of free energy, and more. Why has this knowledge been lost? Because we are currently living in the age of Kaliyuga. Kaliyuga is indeed the dark age, the age of ignorance. And if someone says, we now have amazing technologies, especially recently, which are no more than 100 years old, for the practical implementation of electricity in all areas of our lives, it does not mean at all that electricity as an energy source was unknown to ancient people, or that its influence was not utilized. But it should be remembered that the Vedic civilization in itself is human-centered and oriented towards the development of the individual. In modern civilization, as the philosopher Losef said, a person becomes an appendage to technology, and technology gains complete control over humans. A person operates 100 machines, mobile devices start tracking the individual, their credit rating, and so on. And we see that in the ancient world, technology was not accessible to everyone, primarily. Secondly, people lived much closer to nature, to themselves, and to self-awareness. Yes, it is possible that some external processes were slower, but they were more deeply understood and more internally attuned to self-realization. Certainly, there have always been different groups of people, sages, who specifically cultivated Vedic knowledge. They were a class of Brahmins who, in fact, did not participate in the material life of society, but nevertheless provided society with a connection to their discoveries and knowledge. And the class of society can be called the consumer class, was completely different. It was more conscious and was governed by, in another system, it was a monarchical system. When we talk about the concept of a monarchical system, it is important to understand that in a monarchy, there exists a different Veda that describes the ideal king, the ideal leader, who is honest and just. Then he, so to speak, fights against corruption and injustice in society. Such Vedic monarchs often ruled prosperous, successful countries. This does not mean that there were no wars, conflicts, and so on between them, but the legal worldview system itself exists eternally and goes through various stages, which are called yugas, temporal phases, such as Satya Yuga. At that time, people did not need writing, and there were far fewer people. They possessed incredible mystical qualities and transmitted knowledge telepathically, and could travel through time and space without any external technologies. Therefore, the technologies themselves were their inner mystical yoga that they cultivated. Then, in the Dvapara age, this appears, by the way, followed by the third Yuga in the Dvapara age. In the third Yuga, there arises a need for a system of social organization and statehood, because it stratifies, and for its maintenance and existence, an initial form of governance, and laws is necessary. Further, society becomes even more structured into different countries, states, and regions, and languages. To maintain it, not only a system of legislation is needed, but also strength. And the power is used to a greater extent to bring the laws and principles to realization. And society is fragmenting. Yes, different religious currents and movements are emerging that conflict with each other, along with political currents and political views. Well, the modern world is essentially the Kali Yuga, an era of complete degradation, when the divine can be said to be entirely removed from human life, and it is replaced by external religion. A superficial social history written for illiterate people, and a very, one might say, limited science that, in essence, forces one to deny all progressive aspects, including spirituality. It is evident that the religion that existed in the Middle Ages was extremely primitive and not coincidental, as it was largely a political tool for governance. We can say that, in general, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam are politicized in the Kaliyuga because people do not want to follow the inner essence of spirituality. They need external forms, and they are attached to external forms, which are nothing more than a superficial religious idea. For example, one must be good, do all good, and be against all that is bad. But what is good and bad, no one clearly explains. Second, when someone speaks of something good, that good is viewed as a benefit for a particular confession, state, or group of people. And remarkably, what is considered good for a group of investors may be seen as bad for a group of workers. Therefore, all these deviations from the truth occur in Kali Yuga due to the degradation of humanity itself, primarily the degradation of spiritual personalities, the degradation of spiritual teachers, and the degradation of politicians, and the demonic influence of the Kali Yuga on all living beings. Because the Kali Yuga in which we live lasts for 432,000 years, living beings are indeed primarily under the influence of the energy of ignorance. And this is done so that, first, those who wish to immerse themselves in this tamas of ignorance can fully receive all the results they strive for, thanks to their free will, while those rare souls who want to emerge from ignorance clearly understand the distinction between truth and ignorance. Therefore, in Kali Yuga, we can very clearly understand the boundaries of what is good and what is bad. But due to the weakness of character, in Kali Yuga, even people who truly know what is indeed good cannot always follow it. The main problem is that, as they say, deep down we are all decent people, but life forces us to steal. Deep down we are all decent people, but life forced everyone to steal. And so, such a state of being in lies, in duality, in the conflict of external and internal interests, this is the era in which we live now. In this era, knowledge of the Veda is essential. However, we cannot attain complete knowledge of the Veda in this age due to our lack of quality. If a person wants to enroll in a very serious scientific university, in a very complex department, they must pass a qualifying exam and demonstrate quality. To become a student, one must be open to being taught. If a person does not exhibit these qualities, they are not accepted, not because they are bad, but simply because they do not possess enough qualities to grasp this knowledge. Therefore, it does not mean at all that if we surround ourselves with a multitude of Vedic textbooks and start reading them, studying Sanskrit, we will acquire quality. No. In Kali Yuga, there is generally a Vedic embodiment of Lord Krishna, who appeared as a sage. He initially gathered all the Vedic knowledge into a single system, briefly, concisely, and comprehensively. He recorded all these Vedic texts in the form of 18 Puranas. Ultimately, on the advice of his guru, he recorded the supreme among all Puranas, the Bhagavata Purana, as well as the Ishikas, such as the Mahabharata and Ramayana. In other words, it can be said that he gathered all the most important Vedic literature, recorded it, divided it into sections, and taught this knowledge to his four main acharyas, disciples, who subsequently taught their own students. Well, in any case, according to the predictions of Veda Vyasa. After the Kali Yuga, this knowledge will increasingly be misunderstood and unrecognized by society, and there will be fewer and fewer enlightened teachers who will fully possess this knowledge. And yet, there is a way out. As always in Kali Yuga, the era in which we are currently living, the highest knowledge is the knowledge of Bhakti, of love, because the last, 18th Purana, Srimad Bhagavatam, is dedicated precisely to the development of Krishna consciousness, specifically to the development of love for God. Ultimately, all Vedic works indeed lead us to love for God. And love can be conscious and unconscious in many ways, both in our lives. There is a conscious love that is built on the understanding of the nature of God. Such love is described in the Vedas as service to God with rules and prescriptions. But the highest love is the love that has reached its full purity, like metal that, during melting, is purified from various impurities and becomes pure metal. Similarly, the love described by Vedavyasa in the 10th song, Shma Advaga, in this realization of Krishna, is a love full of inner spontaneous experience, a relationship between the soul and God. And there, knowledge has a surface level and not deeply understood meaning. Well-being and overall attraction to God hold much greater value. And in Bhakti Yoga, we study precisely this path. the path of spontaneous love. But this does not mean that we should reject all systems of spiritual knowledge and all spiritual practices that are meant to lead us to the purification of consciousness. No, of course not. The Vedas describe that a person in this world is contaminated by material consciousness. Just as the body is contaminated by toxins, the body must eliminate toxins in the form, so to speak, of excrement. Similarly, human consciousness is contaminated by material energy, and a person must constantly purify their consciousness through spiritual practice. Otherwise, they will not be able to experience subtle spiritual states and the vibrations of their soul. Therefore, love itself and the path of love do not reject the fact that we exist in the world of matter and we need transformation. On the contrary, it shows that this transformation will occur in the fastest and most perfect way through the acceptance of love. I can give an example. For instance, there is a very popular philosophy of the Stoics, which has won the hearts of many people, because Stoicism is an attitude towards problems. And we are always living, so to speak, solving various problems, and it is very important for us how we relate to them. But in the modern version of Stoic philosophy, there is no mention of the role of God at all. However, it is important to understand that the Stoics themselves were deeply religious people. They could believe in God in different ways, the Greeks in their own way, and Europeans in their own way. But in any case, the main foundation of true philosophy is faith. Philosophy without faith is merely a mental construct, and therefore, faith is undoubtedly connected with love. Faith and love are two facets. One cannot exist without the other. Because how can you love someone you fear? And how can you fully believe and trust someone who is your enemy, whom you feel fear towards? It is impossible. Therefore, both love and faith are boundaries. The same inner and truly divine feeling, which is deeply called Bhakti. And the more a person learns about God, the less he begins to fear him, and the more he starts to trust him and walk the path of love. And at that moment, knowledge and some of its material and objective experience ultimately lose their true value. Knowledge is valuable when we have not yet reached the state of love. It is like a stage of a rocket that takes us into the orbit of love, knowledge of karma yoga. And therefore, the Vedas say that although love is the highest spontaneous feeling that develops primarily through communication with the devotees of Krishna, with those people who possess this love. However, to reach this state, we need some luck, some fortune, and some faith, so to speak, a starting capital. As a result of our religious and spiritually pious activities, we accumulate a certain amount of starting capital. Pious merits are not yet bhakti nor spiritual knowledge. It is merely a platform to notice a spiritual teacher, to become interested in a certain spiritual topic, to discover some important questions, perhaps through one's pain, through one's problem. To understand that here the planets influence me, and here karma influences me. And what is karma? And is there a God? And who controls the planets? Yes, because we want to deal, so to speak, with the policeman who finds us. But we know that, at least in America, if we go to court and sincerely repent before the judge, he may waive some of the fines against us. Just because we acknowledge the fact that when we were students, we didn't have money to pay for fines, we drove incorrectly, and so on. But seeing that we have grown up and changed our attitude towards the world, the judge may dismiss the case against us. There was a very touching video that shows how an American judge forgives fines for an elderly man who was stopped by the police for speeding and was issued a very large fine. And the judge asks, "What was the reason for your speeding? You are an elderly person, you need to drive very carefully." And he says, "My 65-year-old son was very unwell. I was taking him to the hospital. I was in a great hurry because I absolutely felt that he might possibly be having a severe heart attack." And the judge stood up, cried, and said, "What a love there is, from a father to a son, and I forgive you." These penalties were all imposed. Why did this happen? Because the judge saw the reason, but rather a consequence. A penalty is a consequence, but what is the cause? And therefore the Vedas say, always seek the root cause in everything. Seek the Lord. Seek the source of love and harmony. Seek a relationship seek problems within yourself, and do not look for problems in the external world. And it is thanks to this approach that the Vedas offer us for understanding the world, our nature, and our soul. And the Vedas themselves unequivocally confirm that it is indeed Bhakti and Yoga that represent the highest goal of the Veda. Although, when studying some more, let's say, superficial, purely scientific works, it may seem to us that a certain sage is showing us how the universe is structured and how living beings operate. All this knowledge exists within the framework of the divine constitution, the main principle of which is the Lord's love for all living beings, the inherent freedom of the soul to do good and evil, and the ability to return to a relationship with the Lord at any moment, or conversely, to deviate from it due to selfish desires of the ego. They describe not only love, but also the principle that love exists on the platform of freedom. And the world we live in, everything that happens in our world, is the only, so to speak, reason to understand its imperfection, simply because we have been given the freedom to be imperfect. If the Lord took away our freedom to imperfection, there would be no conflicts and wars, and there would also be no freedom to come to love. It is like the night, which is given to appreciate the day. If there were only day, it would have no value.